The marsh fires burned low, wind worrying at the blue tongues until they snapped and curled to embers. Sala Reed crouched in the peat and watched them weather the gusts. The bog breathed in strange ways when cold took hold. The air seemed to move sideways, and the grasses had a hiss beneath their blades. She put a hand to the ooze, to feel the deep heat of the earth in her palm the way her mother had taught her. It soothed. Up above, the sky had the thin, paired look of winter nights. Shaved moon, a scrape of stars. In the distance, a wolf called and was answered along the spine of the green country. Still, her father whispered behind her. He was small and wiry as marsh willow, and he wore his hair close to his skull, greased against the damp. "I am," Sala said. The spear in her hand was not the ash she had been raised to grip, but something older, black and glassy, the head napped to a thin, hungry edge. It gleamed faintly, though there was no flame to catch. Whenever her fingers slid over it, they tasted of flint. Her father's breath smoked. "Watch the low ground. You'll see it where warmth goes sideways." They had seen it 3 nights ago, in a hollow where reeds bent as if a hand pressed them down. The fog there had not moved with wind. It had seeped uphill, quiet as the slow head of a serpent. In its curl, beneath its skim of hoarfrost, something had walked that left no sinking footprint but scuffed a slick over the puddles that froze and refroze as it passed. That night, the dogs back at Greywater's camp had whined without lifting their heads. Even the old bearhound who feared nothing else. Not eel spirits, not men. Now Sala breathed cold and listened to the marsh sing. She had tied little bells along a cord to catch what wind there was, and they chattered to one another above the hummocks. She had hung the cords with feathers dipped in tar and ichor and winter wine, and the feathers spun. Nothing moved in the fog, but the fog was slower than the breath of any living thing. When she saw the first glimmer, she did not call to her father. Her spear lifted, and her eyes narrowed in the dark. The glimmer was not light, not lantern, not moon's reflection. It was an absence, like the blind side of a star when thin cloud passes. It moved at the height of a tall man's chest. The reeds along one runnel laid themselves flat in sequence. Beyond them, a shape loomed and unloomed, again and again, as if a man made of black silk were folding and unfolding as he walked. Her father's hand closed on her shoulder, and she felt his fingers harden with resolve. He had told her what to do. Keep the fire low. Do not run if it sees you, no, not sees. If it turns toward you. The old words mattered. Nothing dead truly saw. They turned. They remembered. They followed. Sala reached to her belt and loosened the crookhorn. She lifted it, put the curve of it to her mouth, and blew softly, the note a reed bird's trill. A moment later, in answer, 3 other horns sounded far off, and she knew the cousins had heard. Green men moved where their land moved. If the marsh needed to lift the entire page of ground under you and slide it to one side, it would. You had to trust it loved you. The glimmer paused. It did not turn. It only paused, and the fog thinned and gathered around it. Sala could see now the line of a shoulder. A head turned slowly, for there was the facsimile of hair, or something like hair, fine and straight and wholly still in the wind. There was the imperfect shape of a face. But what made her hand clench on the glass spear was the glint of something upon its chest. A strip of metal that caught moon and gave it a thin, dying flash as the thing shifted. The metal had been made by hands like hers, old steel polished by weather. Let it go. Her father's breath brushed her ear. We know now they do not sink. We know they skirt the higher tufts. The bog won't take them unless we take them by the hand. I want to see its eyes, she whispered. I want to see the color. No color, he said. You know that. It moved on. It slid up over the low lip of a bank where men had knelt and washed eel guts the day before. The wash had long since frozen. Beneath the ice, the blood had made a rose that would not bloom. As the shape passed, the rose retracted into a hard knot and the ice went brittle. A cracked sound, like a finger bone snapping. The thing paused at the noise and cocked its head as if listening for its own heartbeat. Then it moved away again, deeper into the blind, white fields. Sala put the horn lower. Her teeth touched glass as she moved the spear on her tongue and tasted it again. Then she breathed once, twice, and followed. She knew what the old women would say, foolish, brave, both at once, as reeds are. But these nights, she could not sleep unless she had seen for herself that the things were real, and not only in her father's mouth and in the scary songs the little ones demanded. You could be afraid of a story and live. You could be afraid of a real thing and die. Better to know which fear fit. The moving fog made its way toward the old bittern blind where the marsh edge sharpened to the causeways. Raised strips of earth paved with timber and stone, the lifelines that led south toward the green kingdoms. The causeways had been built when the first drowned trees were still saplings, and people said they had been laid by hands that made walls without mortar and doors without hinges. Sala did not know about that. She knew where the causeways creaked when the season changed, and where you could jump the ditch and land in mud that would hold you only to the knee. It arrived where the path narrowed, where a cart must pass single file between a willow and a pile of stones half sunk. And then, as if it had known it would be seen best here, it turned. Her father's hand bit into her flesh. Sala's heart spiked. She felt its beat. Along the side of her throat, up near her ear where the skin was thin and the cold had made it tender. No color. He was right. The thing before her had eyes like old water under snow. They were not white, not that. They were a shadowy depth without bottom. And in them there was the slow swirl of something like chalk in a bucket. She thought of stirred ash and could not stop. It made her tongue go dry. The thing glanced past her. Perhaps it turned its head to answer some distant cousin in another field. Perhaps the wind found its face and shaped it. When it moved, Sala moved. She slipped out of the hummock, came up the low bank like an eel, and drove as she had been taught. Not for the chest as you would with a man, but for the place at the juncture of shoulder and neck. It was where the dark was thinnest. The spear's point kissed fog, then meat that was not meat. There was a sound like the shivering of ice in a glass. The spear went through too easily, and as she flinched, steadying, she felt an immediate numbing along her hands and arms, a snow shock beneath the fingernails that radiated to her wrists. She bit her cheek to keep her teeth from chattering, and drove again, turning the napped head, making it slice, cut like nothing she had ever held. There was brittle resistance, as if she were cutting through bundles of glass rod tied with hair. The thing lifted its hand. It wore old leather and iron on its wrist, and beneath that, she glimpsed something etched like a memory of age-old runes, a polite corrosion. It struck for her chest but moved slowly enough or she was quick. She slipped under and to the side, and the spearhead bit again. The sound came, not a cry, she would have preferred a cry. A breath movement, like a door that had never been oiled, being opened a thumb's width for a very long time. Then it came apart. Not into pieces. That would have made sense. It came apart like a shadow torn by candlelight. One piece went down the causeway and broke into dark chips that lay for a moment in the ice before vanishing as if melted. Another went into the reeds and slid under the water without a ripple. A third thinned into fog, thicker for an instant, then the same as everything else. Where it had been, a crust of frost thickened briefly, then flaked away. Sala stood very still and listened. Her father tugged the back of her tunic and drew her backward without a word. The bells chattered again. Far off, another horn answered hers, then another, then a fourth that did not speak as loudly and stuttered in the last breath. That one was Ben's boy Leaf, who had only just learned to blow and always ran out too soon. "Back," her father whispered. "We know they can be broken. Now we see how many friends it has." "Not enough," Sala said, and her teeth chattered anyway. "Not enough to come far if we can find glass for every hand." "Glass," he said. "Glass and fire and patience. Send the ravens, girl. Send 5 where 1 will do." His fingers were warm at last on her shoulder. "And tell them to come to us. Not to the north. Here, to the throat." "I'll tell them," Sala said. She breathed out slowly, and steam bled from her lips into the night. "If they still listen to us. They listen every time hunger bends their spine." Her father's laugh, a small, cold thing. "And hunger is here," the marsh sang on. "Far away, beyond the leagues of thorn and wormwood and winter water, high walls waited that were not of the north. Rhianna Blackwood sat under the raven tree and watched snow stick and not stick to the dark red leaves. In deep winter, the raven tree wore blood. In spring, it wore rust. Men said its roots threaded through every hall her house had ever held and found what bones had been laid there. In the heart of winter, the reddening sky looked like mirrors set to face one another. The tree reflected it in the leaves reflected it in her eyes. She had learned to speak beneath this bough more than 30 years ago. She had walked away from the things she loved here, too, with her hands clenched so tight around a torn letter that the sigil on the wax had printed red against her palm for a day. She had taken an oath no one else heard, at the Weir's little milk-white face, that she would outlast men who thought her house held because of men. Now a new letter lay unfurling on her knees. Wind worried the edges and the thread that had bound it. Rhianna put a forefinger on the tail to hold it still and read the flowing hand again. She had read it twice already. Each reading cut another thin slice of skin from her pride. She had treasured that pride because there was so little else. The Riverlands were a hard cup and men poured them dry. Lady Rhianna Blackwood, the words said, in a hand whose loops had been schooled at the Citadel. By order of His Grace Aegon, King of the Isles and the Rivers, Lord of Pike and Harrenhal, Defender of the Trident, the levy of Raventree shall march within 8 days to Harrenhal to render service in the King's war against the Vale. Failure to muster will be accounted disobedience and met as treason. Hostages, as previously pledged, will remain under the eye of the crown. In belief of your ladyship's wisdom and demonstrated submission, I remain. A name followed, went, a lesser, a captain in that bleak castle service. At the bottom, a strip of sealing wax showed the crown driftwood of horror. Rhianna read it one more time to give herself the slight relief of fury fully chosen. Arden, her old master-at-arms, stood in the wind at the edge of the tree's roots, pretending to look at the wall where snow slid in little curls along the battlement. They'll call, she said. They'll send word the same day to every house whose men can bear a spear. They'll pull us to Heron's Folly and hold our children in exchange for our knees. Arden scraped his knuckles against the leather at his hip. He had a habit of polishing what did not need polishing when he could not think what to say that would not risk his tongue. We can send your son another letter, he said. Ask for. No, Rhianna said too quickly. Then she softened her voice. No ravens to my son. The last found him a gilded cage. Another will gild the bars. She rose, leaving the letter on the root. Snow slid from the raven tree's leaves behind her and pocked the parchment. We will march, she said, and the words tasted like iron. We will march because we love our children more than we hate Ironborn. Arden's eyes slid up. He was not tall, but his presence was a wall. She looked into his tired patience and found her own steadied. If we march, they'll break us on the Blackwater or at the Bloody Gate. You know the Vale does not bend. Aegon's men think every hill is a wave and every castle a wreck. It's not the Vale that worries me, Rhianna said. It's the space our leaving leaves. She lifted her eyes toward the west. Ice-gray sky gathered above the river. Somewhere, behind a curtain of poor weather, Seaguard stood with the sea gnawing its stones, and the Iron Men watched that sea as a man watches his sleeping wife. Aegon means to rake our fields clean. He'll call all men to him because he plans a long war and because he grew up in a castle where the stones whisper louder than lords. They say he takes the high rooms in Harrenhal in winter, Arden said. He sits where the old king melted to bone in the tales, and he laughs because no dragon came in his grandfather's time. He thinks castle is stronger than fear. Fear has longer roots than stone, Rhianna said. She bent and gathered the letter. Send Jaren Mallister word to meet me at the Millbridge. He owes me a courtesy, and I will owe him one. If we are to leave, I would know if he leaves with us or holds Seaguard. Either way, we will make our own plan. Plan, Arden said. He only said the word once and made it sound like counsel. Everything we do for the king, Rhianna said, we also do for ourselves. If Aegon pulls the Riverlands like bowstring sinew, the string will snap in a good archer's hand and whip back into his eye. We will leave garrisons that belong to us, not to him. And if something worse than Ironborn comes crawling, she swallowed. There are letters from the neck that do not read like children's songs. The marsh folk never ask for company. Now they ask. Winter tales, Arden said, and did not put scorn on it. His voice held only the old soldier's weary hope that this, at least, would not be true. We have enough iron truths. Winter doesn't care if iron hates it, Rhiannon said. Write to the twins. I will sit in Lothar Frey's nasty hall and let him smirk and still get what I want. Write too to the Brackens. Arden's head came up sharp. My lady, I am picking between knives, she said. I will hold the blade if I must. I will hand the hilt to my enemy if he can cut what threatens me more. It is not love. It is arithmetic. She looked past him into the branches, where 3 ravens shifted and muttered to each other. And if the tree thinks I am wrong, will it whisper? Will it bite? I have stood here full of blood and empty of tears, and it said nothing then. It is not its way, Arden said. It only remembers. It doesn't warn. I give it something to remember, Rhiannon said. Then I go to Harrenhal to kiss a black stone king's hand. She folded the letter into her girdle. Fetch me a style of humility. You know the sort. I know the sort, Arden said, and bowed and went. The sea ran black under Seagard's walls, black as if all the stars had fallen into it and drowned. Ser Geron Mallister had known that sea since he was a boy. It had taken his father and given him a sword belt in return, and he did not yet know if that had been a fair trade. He stood in the tower room the fisherman called the Shell and watched a shape move on the water with that same sideways ripple he could not learn or love. He lifted the glass and drew the shape into closer question. The boat was long and smear-dark, hardly a boat at all. A rib cage made into a hull, a spine of a mast with a skin thrown over it. Ironborn had a gift for making bones out of anything. He put the glass down and counted in his head. 1, 2, 3 boats, low, no sail but the scant scrap to catch enough wind, the one long or each to steer. They did not come like men. They came like wolves, stretched into their stride until their stride was all that could be seen. Geron had placed stakes where river returned to sea. He had set cressets lit and ready at the places where men would like to climb. He had got himself 50 crossbowmen who knew how to load without looking down. He had a new thing too, unproven. A line of tarred cord he had strung from tower to tower that could be cut with a pull and fall in slaps of burning twine across ladders. He had dreamed that up 3 weeks ago and woke smiling like a child. It would be useless if the sea laughed at him. The sea often laughed at men who thought. My lord, said Kennit, his man of chambers, who was old enough to be his father and so never called him by his name. A raven from Raventree. The bird bit Jory twice. I'll let Jory show the scar to the girls, Geron said. He held his hand out without looking and felt the weight of the tube placed in his palm. He broke the wax with the edge of his nail and let the parchment unfurl. His eyes went there and stayed until he had read the words and read them again and felt a growl rise in his throat that surprised him with its boyishness. He had broken a tooth at 14 on another boy's helm and had not growled since. They march you, too, Kennit said softly. They march us all, Geron said. He went to the window slit and watched the boats again, not because they were nearest danger, but because looking at the nearest danger aided his hands. Aegon means to pluck the veil's feathers, he said. If it were only that, I might enjoy the sight. But he means also to use us to do it, and then to say it was his hand that did the plucking, and then to use us again to fight the next thing he remembers he hates. He is a man who will die of his own appetite, and in the meantime we will starve to make him fat. That is a quality of kings, Kennit said. All of them. You are old enough to know it and young enough to hope otherwise. Both at once make you dangerous. Tell the crossbowmen to sleep with their boots on, Geron said. We'll have a raid tonight. The boats go in where the tide makes them a little drunk. I'll give them wine enough to lay them down. Then he folded the letter, slid it into his sleeve. And send to Lady Rhiannon. Say I will meet her and smile and bow and say yes to things I may not be able to do. It matters to say yes. You want her eyes on you, not on Harrenhal, Kennit said. I want her eyes on the river, Geron said. When this winter gets its teeth in the north and the marshes freeze hard enough to bear a cart, things may come south that do not smell of salt. I would like someone else to have noticed it besides me. Kennit crossed himself out of long habit. He had been born to the mother and still prayed when he polished a sword. Winter tales, he said. Winter is a tale we tell to explain being hungry, Jaren said. Then sometimes the tale becomes the only thing listening. And if the tale hears us, it comes. He did not believe half the things he said, and yet he heard himself say them. Words had their own bone-white faces, he thought. They remembered the mouths that gave them shape. He went to strap on his sword and told himself not to think at all until morning. On Dragonstone, the fires had gone out, and the men who kept the dragon roads polished had died with their hands on their chamois. Once, on a night of rain hard as nails, Aegon had stood on the headland and watched lightning walk the sea. He had decided that night that he would do what he and his sister had spoken of since childhood, a thing made half of story and half of stubbornness. Then his wife had died in her childbed, and his sister had died of fever, and his younger dragon, Meraxes, had not woken even when the forge bells were rung. The world had felt smaller to him then, and the sky had lowered its weight. He had not found that night again. The Targaryen who lived now on Dragonstone was named Balon. He had never flown. There was nothing left to fly. He had a small, careful wife who had brought him twin girls, and he walked sometimes in the belly of the castle and put his hand on scales old as a sin and felt only stone. He wrote letters to Old Town about histories and received, sometimes, a polite reply with a drawing in the margin of a scholar's hand that made dragons look like minced crocodiles. Balon had taken, in a quiet fury, to painting the sea in storm and had hung storm after storm along a corridor until his wife said she could not bear to walk there and he had them taken down. He would never invade anything. He had run out of verbs. He had adjectives and dots of color. In his sleep, he sometimes woke with his mouth forming a word. He had not taught it and found it was not his tongue at all but some old man's who had died 200 years ago and had not stopped wanting. In the morning, he made porridge for his daughters himself and salted it and watched them eat, and that was a thing with a verb. Men mocked him. It did not reach him. The world had chosen another shape and he was an object that rolled along its floor. He was not unhappy except on clear days when the sun made the last scales shine. Argos Durandon wore a cloak of storm blue and a crown shaped like a lightning fork. He had the pride of an oak that had seen every sapling die of shallow root, and he had the memory of every Durandon who had gazed east and thought, mine. He did not have a son, and it made him careful. He had 3 brothers, and it made him savage. Argos stood in the hall at Storm's End with its impossible ceiling and its pillars that held up the sky, and he listened to a maester who had walked half the length of the reach in winter and nearly died twice for the privilege of being tedious before so much stone. And I say again, Your Grace, the marsh letters are not like children's songs. They come with the authority of Maester Benfer at Moat Cailin, who is no reed-breathed man, and of Brother Harlan, who has the honor of tending the old well at Lord Stark's gate, and honor, Argos said. Answer me this, Old Town's man. Why does Stark send to me if there is breath in his own house and swords at his own belt? The maester's head twitched as if pulled by 2 strings. Your Grace is an ancient ally of ancient kings. I have made war with ancient kings for 5 times as long as I have worn this ring, Argos said, and held up his right hand so the dull gold saw its reflection in his eyes. The North has never asked me for my breath unless it wanted to make its winter last longer, like an old story. Perhaps this is what it is. Perhaps it is not. Touches me as lightly as 2 feathers on my shoulders. Maester, perhaps I shake them off. Perhaps I hide them beneath mail. The choice is mine. Our letters say only what we say, the Maester said miserably. What your Grace chooses is. Argos lifted a hand and saw the man go still. Then he turned and looked into the face he loved most after his wife's. It hung on the far wall, vast and black. The painting the late king had commissioned of the storm that had unroofed the new docks the year before Argos had been born. In it, waves had the back of horses. In it, a ship was tipped such that men on her deck had their feet planted on the very edge of falling. One man was painted with a hand on a line that was lifting from the sea. the H, and was wrong. The painter had thought fingers were enough. Argos had never forgiven him for the absence of palm. If cold comes sideways, Argos said, as if to the painting, it will come to my marches. The neck is the throat to all of us. If it hardens, if the causeways become a bridge, if the living things that know those paths starve or are hunted from them, then the north is a room whose door is off its hinges. My father used to say, if you could drink the sea, you could float the stormlands. He did not drink the sea. He died, and his son stays dry and keeps watch. I want to be the man who closed the door, not the one who built a bigger hall because he thought it would keep wind out. The maester gulped. Then your grace will. I will call my banners, Argos said. I will march to the neck, and if Stark refuses me his gate, I will knock with this crown until his rafters shake. But I will not go alone. Send to Old Town. Send to the Mander. The gardeners trade in thought and reputation, and they will like the taste of being seen to think for all of us. Send to Casterly Rock. Tywald Lannister is a man who can count. He will count his years and see he has not so many he can afford to lose one to famine if the fields are snow too long. Send to the Vale if you like. They will mince their words and dust them with sugar and ride down from their nest only when the wind is tame. And if Dorne wants to send bright cloth and knives that curve, let them. We are not too proud to use what suits. The maester wiped his lip. And King Aegon? Argos smiled, and it was sharp. Ah, Heron's grandson. He will send for me if I do not send for him, and he will call me by the wrong name when I stand in his hall to remind me where I am. But he will march, because if he does not, the Riverlands will find men to love more than salt. He lifted a hand, and the chamberlain stepped from the shadow. Call the grooms. Send ravens. Tell my brothers I will choose one of them to carry the storm before me, and the one who squabbles least over it will wear it. And tell the kitchens that a thin stew leaves men cold. I want the smell in the yard to reach the road. Tywald Lannister slept as men with full bellies sleep, with his hand loose upon the coverlet and his mouth slightly open, unafraid to look foolish in his own dreams. He had a head of gold that had not thinned with age, and a way of speech that could turn on its heel and smile. When the letter came in from Storm's End, he read it once and smiled at the way Argos's man had tried to make short sentences seem longer with titles. He read another, from Old Town, full of worry about tales from the marsh. He read a third, from Harrenhal, that did not ask but commanded. He folded all three and put them into his pocket and walked down to the great window carved into the lion's chest in the rock, and there watched a winter morning he had not asked for and could not refuse. He loved war and hated it the way a man who could not dance loved winter balls. He was good at the steps and looked handsome when he took them, and yet the whole time he was moving he thought about where else he might be. But this winter might not ask him to dance in the usual way. He had heard that word sideways in an Old Town letter. He had never known cold to move any way but straight through you. He could not imagine it choosing a road. But then men had told him there were fish in the far north that sang when they lay upon the ice, and he had laughed until an outfitter from Seaguard showed him a bell and said, "Here is the mouth it sings through." He went to find his daughter. She was stables now and always stables when she wanted not to be found. He sometimes imagined she slept in the straw with her head on a warm neck and woke smelling of horse. He found her not in the stalls but standing on the low wall that looked out across the sea. Her hair was braided into a crown that circled twice. It made her head look held. She had plucked falcons as a child and never wept when they bled. "Father," she said without turning, "it smells like snow the way bread smells like beginnings. It smells like men wanting," he said, and came to stand beside her. "Every king in this half of the world will have a letter this week. They will find a way to make winter a proof of themselves." She glanced at him sidelong and laughed. "You sound as if you still like them," she said. "I prefer them to priests," he said. "They do not try to tell the sun which way to go about its business." He touched her braid. "Argos calls. Harrenhal commands. Old Town wrings its hands and says something is coming as if that were news. I think I will count our grain and smile. If Argos marches, I will go to the neck with him because that is where the world is narrowest and where a small man can cut a large one if he knows his angles. But I will cut with gold. Would Iron. I will take wagons and plows and men who know how to lay road. And when the snow melts, I will own the road. Men forget the last man to bless a bridge. They remember the first one to tax it. His daughter nodded gravely. I want to go. You will go, he said, because she had always gone where she wanted and he had discovered she brought him luck. But you will not be only pretty on a horse. You will negotiate with Argos for me when I am too proud to ask. You will listen to Old Town's men until their eyes glaze, and then you will write what they should have said. And if you see any old stones with carvings on them, you will draw them. There is a charm on objects that do not move, and I want it. Perhaps it could keep us standing while winter knocks. You sound as if you fear a story, she said softly. I fear being the villain in a story told later, he said. I do not mind being dull in something no one repeats. The Vale knew other names for winter. They called it the polite guest who stayed too long. They see. Aled at the fast. They called it the empty orchard. In the Ares' high rooms, the air itself seemed held in its palm. Cassandra Aaron slept little and woke often with a kind of humming in her chest, as though the mountain had kept a bee for her heart. When the letters came, Storm's End first, then Casterly Rock, then a river hand from Harrenhal that spoke as if her maids should curtsy to it. She put them one atop another, laid a white hand upon them, and smiled without showing her teeth. Kings, she told the room, which was carved in a way that made sound leave it slowly, like guests reluctant to be rude. This winter will not make me lower my table for their hands. Her brother, who had a face soft as bread dough and kindness enough to ruin 3 dogs and 2 men, said, We should send you. You will make them quarrel quietly and eat. I will send my son, Cassandra said, and turned her head so that he could not see the sliver of anger that always came when she said it. He will come down the bloody gate with the eagles. He will speak to Argos as one hawk to another. He will look at Tywald Lannister and see his counting. He will tell Harren's boy we are not Riverstone to be juggled. The marsh letters, her brother said, and his soft face went shapeless for a second, like something on a spoon. Do you believe? I believe anything told without desire, and the marsh men do not desire, she said. They only warn. If the others walk, the wall will shake first, and then the neck, and then this whole table we lay bread on will buckle and we will drop our knives. If the others do not walk, winter will still bite the small folk to bone. I will send grain with the knights. We will arrive polite and empty-handed of insults. Dorne did not winter in a way the North understood, but the Red Mountains knew cold sometimes when night fell and the wind came with teeth from over the sands. Prince Nymer Martell read the raven's mutterings with a smile that looked like shade. He kept a map of the world he knew on a table with a line of blue glass stones. He set to show where courtesies wound and where they snapped. When a messenger came with 3 slivers of obsidian tied in a bit of soft leather, Nymer lifted them between thumb and forefinger and looked into their shine and did not let the man see that he had never before held that cold so lightly. He sent a caravan north not with soldiers but with sacks of grain like pillows and with a chest. The chest held glass he had himself bought from a man who came in from the desert in a coat made in Valyria before the doom. The man had smiled and said, No dragons now, Prince. Nymer had smiled back and said, No dragons yet. If the North wants glass, he told his sister, who was the only one he told anything that mattered, they may come to Dorne to buy it next time, but I will send them 1 chest at no cost. If the dead do not walk, it will sit in some hall and be talked about when men are drunk. If they walk, I can say I was the first to give. He touched 1 black sliver gently to his lip and then to hers. You always wanted jewels. I wanted weapons that make jewels, she said dryly, and a husband with a better chin. But I will take this gift. He sent the caravan with 20 spears and a letter that spoke as if the world were one room, and he wrote on the table. He sent it not to the North first but to Raventree and then to Seaguard. He knew his winds. The North loved the North. The Riverlands loved anyone who remembered their name. Harrenhal stones drank cold. Men who had slept in that castle sometimes woke thinking they had wintered in the belly of a beast that ate frost. Arion Hoare loved it as a man loves the thing that makes him feel large. He sat in a chair his grandfather had carved with a knife while drunk. tightening that old man's work with a bit of sand whenever the grain lifted, as if making the chair smoother might make his line less crude. His hands smelled of oak and oil. He read the winter letters and laughed. He laughed at Argos, whose cloak he imagined soaked with rain. He laughed at Tywald, whose gold he envied and might not wrest away. He did not laugh at Asandra Arryn, for she never sent him anything he could hold laughing in his mouth, like a small, mocking stone. Her messages were pure salt. He would march because he would not be seen to lag behind a lion. He would call the river lords because he liked to know they learned obedience like a prayer. And he would send men to pin the veil to its eyrie until it starved for conversation. Where the marsh singed, he did not much care. The marsh was for reeds and frogs and things you only ate when a siege went poorly. He would hear about that when it mattered. The ravens went. They crossed sky that was suddenly larger than men had remembered because the sun sat lower and the air believed in it less. They cut snow with their wings and the snow did not bleed. In 8 days, the river lords rode for Harrenhal with their small banners cracking and their riders hiding smirks or fear. Rhianna Blackwood went with 2 hostages at Aegon's hall and a smile in her pocket. Jaren Mallister watched the sea with one eye and chose men to leave and men to take with the other. Argos Durrandon boiled his stew thick, then rode with brothers glancing at one another like knives on a table where a blind man runs his hand. Tywald Lannister harnessed his wagons and sent a raven to the man in charge of his forges to make plowshares that could be hammered into spearheads without apology. The Vale sent knights from the sky with white mantles that would show every stain. Dorne uncoiled a long ribbon of quiet generosity and tied it to a map where the world narrowed. North of the neck, Sala Reed and her cousins cut low points into glass with patience older than glass. They had found an old place where black popped from the dirt like teeth in a gum. The earth had a memory. 2. Men at the wall wrote careful letters between attacks. They did not name attacks, but only nights too loud. The dire wolves came down as far as the King's Road, and men who saw them went into their halls and shut their doors softly as if not to wake what the wolves fled. Harrenhal held assembly as if it had learned how to be warm. Fires were lit in every hearth and men coughed black for days after. Rhianna stood under the great beam and watched Aegon's mouth. He had teeth like a man who had not learned restraint, white and too many shown at once. He spoke of the Vale. He did not speak of winter. He spoke of Argos wanting to be seen. He spoke of Tywald wanting to own the roads. He made men laugh at both and then said, in another breath, that they would follow both. When he commanded Rhianna to leave half her men in Harrenhal, she bowed with her hands hidden and clenched. When he told Jaren Mallister to send every able man and leave Seaguard to its stones, Jaren smiled and asked for 5 days to prepare, and Aegon, who liked to see a man confident because he had put the confidence there himself, gave him 3. Jaren's eyes flicked to Rhianna's once, and she saw in them a plan made of thin sticks braced cleverly. The plan was simply this: leave men on the river that did not look like men. Leave women in men's mail with nets. Leave old men with crossbows and girls with knives shaped like kitchen tools and boys who could burn twine cut to fall the way wind fell. The world would think Seaguard empty enough to broach and would find it had teeth. At the mill bridge, Rhianna met him. Jaren had not shaved, and he looked the better for it. A good plan is a lie you tell yourself, he said. This one lies to me, and I believe it. You're not the only one who knows how to hang rope, Rhianna said. I've paid coin to a blacksmith on the Green Fork for iron caltrops that can be thrown plainly across mud. If Ironborn step there with naked feet, they will remember their shoes. They traded small things they had learned. At last Jaren leaned on the rail and said, as if tired of using other people's turns of words, something is wrong with the North. Not wrong with men. Wrong with weather. Wrong with the way breath hangs. Wrong with the way steel looks when it sits by the fire and does not sweat. I want to make a place where that wrongness has to go around me like water around a rock. I do not mind being wet, but I mind being carried. I left 2 ravens in your rookery, Rhianna said. They will not like you. They will like each other. Send them together when you must. The tree at Raventree listens better when words come in pairs. I'll send you something you will not want to read, Jaren said and smiled, and left to make his city look unready. Argos marched with banners that showed storms made into heraldry. The men behind him had a look he loved, a little grin at the corner of the mouth as if expecting to be pleased. He had given them that grin when he fed them at dawn and told them there would be meat even if winter snarled, and men believed a voice that had the floor under it. At Ashford, he set up a hall of leather and waited for Tywald Lannister to come with his wagons. He waited for 2 days. Tywald came for half a day, like a cat returning home after a courtyard fight to get his belly licked and then going back out. "We will go to the neck together," Tywald said. He sat with one knee on a footstool and ate half a pear and was careful not to drench his sleeve with its juice. "We will build a winter camp at the edge of the bog and make a dining table of the causeway stones. I will dig my heels into Moat Caelin's earth and make Stark see I will not be moved," Argos said. "You will not," Tywald said mildly. "You will ask nice. And if he does not open, you will camp anyway and feed your men. And when the dead come, if they do, and you cut one with a pretty glass knife a marsh child sold you for your third best horse, you will send the head to Stark and he will open the gate for you and call you brother. It will be beautiful. And if the dead do not come, you will drink stew in a boot and chafe your ass raw for nothing while Harren steals all the stories by sitting safe in his smoking castle telling other men where to go." Argos laughed. "What do you want, Tywald?" "What I always want," Tywald said. "To be the first to charge fairly but the second to be hit. I brought road builders. I will have profit if winter gives me an ounce of mercy. I brought also a wagon full of Mara's heavy with foal. In spring we will breed the marsh for horses that do not mind mud. I like the thought of that." Isandra Aaron's son came down from the eyrie with his hood thrown back so that the cold could kiss him on the mouth. He made the trip in half the time anyone else did because he did not fear broken ankles, and when he arrived he asked Argos for nothing but a place to wash. He spoke to Tywald for an hour and did not smile, and Tywald liked him. He sent a letter for Aegon Hoare, and it was written in a hand like a sword without a guard. Men stepped a little more carefully when he passed. They were there before Harren's men, for Aegon liked to make an entrance. When finally the black banners rolled over the hill and the smell came with them, the good smell of many horses and the less pleasant, Argos went out to meet him with his cloak swung back so that the storm on it could be seen. They spoke where the ground was at its driest, and they spoke as men do who will not yet admit they may fight beside one another without also fighting one another. "In the Vale they call it the polite guest who stays too long," Argos said. "Shall we call it that, Aegon, and be polite to it? In Pike we call it the season we take what men have laid aside from fear," Aegon said, and smiled too many teeth. "We will be polite to one another in the hall and less polite when the door shuts." "What brings you east?" Argos said. "You have rivers to fail and fields to fail and a castle to sweat." "I come to show my men the marsh," Aegon said. "They have forgotten we have no gills. Also, I come because if I do not, men will say I was drunk while you ate. I do not like men to make jokes about my appetite." Tywald stepped forward before Argos could speak again. "My lord," he said, not calling him Grace, "I have wagons that will need a gap in the line. I will set them back with their horses' heads to the south. When all of this is over or not, there will be a road that remains. In spring ice," Aegon said, but he said it with a flicker of interest. "You will lay your road for my men to march on and I will march them to your gate." "You may," Tywald said pleasantly, "but I will own the toll." Isandra Aaron's son beheld them all and said nothing at first. When he did speak, it was low. "If the marsh letters are right, all our talk is a tall tree with shallow root. We would do better to leach the ground not with words but with patience. My mother sends grain. She asks nothing. She does not believe in buying a gate before you need it." Aegon glanced at him, took his measure, found it too thin to bruise. He did not hide his disdain. Isandra's son did not change his face. Argos noticed that, and so did Tywald. Their eyes touched over Aegon's shoulder. It was as if their fingers had brushed under a table and both withdrawn without apology. Night came early. At dusk, a wind rose that seemed to come from nowhere and then found the marsh and nested in it and mewled. The marsh answered, Sala Reed watched the camp's flower and knew which belonged to men who would listen and which to men who would go where their boots wanted to walk even when the land told them no. She sent cousins with baskets of leeches to Hawkins from Old Town so they would be welcome at fire's edge. She sent little jars of frog hearts tied with string to Assandra's son because men from the high ground always looked surprised when you gave them a gift that had something very like a soul in it. Then she returned to the low trails. The others did not come the way the letters said they would. Men had imagined them a tide. Men had imagined them a clean line of frost. Men had imagined them coming like stories, one after another in a neat file. They came like wind. They came like a thought you think you have not thought before, and then remember you are only remembering that you have forgotten it. They whispered in the reeds, and the reeds answered with a dry laughter that sounded like teeth. They touched the water, and a skin formed over it that looked like onion peel and held a moment and burst and formed again and did not flow. Sala drew her spear like a breath and let it out again when she saw one move. There were 3 tonight. 2 held thin swords, elegant and without nicks. 1 had a spear that carried on it a ribbon thorn. All 3 moved as if the cold lubricated their joints. She thought of oil. She thought of an old man with bones too stiff to bear winter and then waking young. She fought the first and let the second slide past. Her cousin took that one with a wrapped net. They cut, and when glass kissed that wrongness it made sounds that had not been made since before words. When she could breathe again, when she stood with glass sticky with something that was not blood, she knew they had come farther tonight. The camps felt it too. Men who had never believed in anything they could neither stab nor coin looked sideways at the bog. They lay down and rose 3 times each night to piss because the cold was inside their bellies, as if they had swallowed an old moon. Argos Durandon dreamed of open doors. Tywald Lannister dreamed of wagons crossing rivers of black glass where he had to count to quench his fear. He did not wake even when men coughed in his camp. He had taught himself long ago to be generous with rest. At dawn, ravens lifted. 2 went together from Seaguard, and their bodies shadowed in unison across the white fields, and Rhianna looked up when they passed. She was readying to ride for Harrenhal again, for talk of an attack on the gate had quickened. She wondered, at the sight of those paired wings, if Jaren had seen something he needed her to know more quickly than diplomacy allowed. He had seen the sea freeze at its edge. For an hour, the combers that threw their lace against Seaguard stones had kept it up. Then suddenly, slowly, with a kind of wet, embarrassed creak, the lace hardened and lay, and the next wave climbed upon it and slid along it and learned it could not climb. Men with ropes went out on it as if the sea had been tamed by a bridle. Then it cracked and a man disappeared with a small sound like a letter being folded. By noon, the ice was strewn with little black chips like teeth. By nightfall it was glass again, and the men who had laughed at their courage went to their beds with faces burned by cold and humility. Jaren wrote what he had seen and put the letters on those 2 birds because he could not bear the responsibility to one bird alone. He had sent another with a bit of obsidian tied to its leg to Old Town. He did not fear that Old Town would believe him. He feared that Old Town would believe him too slowly. Harrenhal did not rest. Aegon kept his men moving because he liked to tire them the way a man tires a horse and then rides, for then he feels the animal's gratitude for the bit as he imagines it. He sent a company to the Bloody Gate, and Assandra's son beat them back in a neat arc of motion that must have looked on a map like a line drawn by a compulsive old man. The river lads murmured at the loss. Aegon spoke to them in a way that made it sound as if he had given them a gift by losing 100 men. The river lords swallowed the sound and rode to the neck. Argos stood on the first causeway stone that was not crying underfoot and tested its give and liked it. "I would lay a table here and call it a new hall," he said to Tywald. "You are not the only man to feel power when he stands in a narrow place," Tywald said. "Let us stand in it for the right reason. The right reason is often the one that makes you die with your knife in your hand," Argos said. Tywald's daughter, who had been silent for 2 days, said, "I do not plan to die. I plan to see the spring flowers in the marsh that look like bellies. I plan to make a crown of them, and I plan to put it on your head in the privacy of your tent because if you wear it in public, Aegon will make a song." Tywald kissed her brow. "You will make a good story out of me yet," he said. They set their camp with the wrongness as close as brave men could bear. The first day, the others came only by night and in numbers that almost felt polite. The second day, they came also by afternoon with a flat light that made your own skin look like a thing you had worn too long and forgotten you thought it fit. The third day, they came at dawn and felt for the edges of the world with their long fingers and then set to pushing. Sala Reed discovered she could be tired and furious and clever at once. She learned to lay fire not where you wanted warmth, but where you wanted to make wrongness pause and ask itself a question it could not answer. She learned to lead little squads of men from the high kingdoms into places where their step must be light and how not to make them feel it was condescension. She told them stories about the way they themselves were light, the way a person is a lantern when he knows something others do not. She learned to say please to men with crowns in a way that made them do what she had asked because they thought they were saying please to her. Argos fought with an obsidian blade made into the shape of a thing his great-grandfather had carried when he was not yet king. He named its edge and laughed when it chipped and named it again. He saw one of the others cut down a stormlord who had been his friend since childhood, and he did not care that men saw him grit his teeth to keep from making a sound. When he slept, 2 hours in one day and 3 in another, he dreamed of lightning striking ice and ricocheting and pointing back at his own chest. He woke and walked the camp with his cloak thrown open so men could see him in the cold and decide not to be smaller in its mouth. Tywald's wagons turned into walls. Men inside them tied the horses where they could lick one another and not panic and looped rope around the wheels to keep them from moving in the wrong moment. He sent carpenters to cut new causeway timbers and lay them in places where the old ones would not bear. He bought the marsh a gift, a song. He hired a piper and a fiddler and told them to play at dusk that men might hear a human thing before they went to lie in their stiff blankets listening to edge noises. He knew music chewed fear and made it into something easier to swallow. He knew also that Heron's men would listen and call it foolish and not leave the circle of sound and be saved by it without knowing. Issandra's son did not speak often. When he did, men leaned in. He had an arrow with a head of dragged glass he had got for 3 silver buttons, and he made of it an emblem and tucked it behind his ear. He put his knights at the places where the causeway narrowed to only a man's width because he knew they loved to cut competitions and the others would give them one without pride. He wrote letters on his knee to his mother and told her when to send more grain, that it might arrive at a moment when men would feel the kindness as a new warmth, not as another thing to bear. The first breaking happened 2 days later when a wind rose that took the tops off the trees like a grandmother slapping at flies, and the wind was wrong. It came from the east and wrapped around Argos's tent and made the pennon twist on its staff. It came across the causeway and made the fires lie down like dogs. It came through men's hair as if combing it against the grain. In its belly, the others moved with a grace that made a man who saw it think of dance and then be ashamed. They came in a sheet like slow rain, and where they passed, the stones of the causeway became a surface that did not like to be cut. Sala ran the line from west to east and shouted where to plant torches and where to pull back as if she were drawing one of the maps she made with her nose when she swam. One nostril closed to tell the river which way to go. Jaron Mallister, in Argos's camp now, cut 2 that were too close together and did not chip his blade on their weapons. He had learned to angle and to pull and to keep pulling because motion mattered. Riala Blackwood's men held the place where the causeway met a tangle of old roots and made a wall of spear points and did not yield until 1/3 of them fell, and then only because standing had become a worse memory than stepping back. Arion Hoare, who had never believed in etiquette, moved his men toward the squeal of fear and there found nothing to terrorize but the cold itself. He set his line badly and lost half a day repairing it. He did not speak afterward. He walked among his men and smiled without showing his teeth, and they loved him for that, as men will love a man who knows how to hold back. When the wind fell, the camp breathed. Men counted fingers. They counted toes. They counted friends. Tywald counted carts and saw he had lost only 2 and kissed the head of the carpenter who had laid the new timbers and returned to work. Argos slept 3 hours in a chair and woke angry at himself for the weakness. Issandra's son drew a map of where the others had moved with the butt of his knife in salt spilled on a board. Sala sat down on a hummock and put her hand on glass and lifted it and saw frost print her palm and did not flinch. By D. On the dead had learned. That was what Sala called it because she needed to think they could learn in order to believe they could be taught to go away. They came where the road had been thickened. They came where they had met fire and pressed their hands against it as if trying to remember warmth. They came where the marsh narrowed and the men were thick, and they set their spears into spaces between bodies and slid them in as if the bodies were cloth. By afternoon, everything was blood and everything was steam. The air tasted of coins held long in the mouth. Argos saw one of them, taller, broader, wearing iron around its middle fashioned into a belt with a buckle shaped like a wolf's head. It moved differently, as if its joints were not as supple. An old thing. He told himself not to want its death too much. He wanted it. He made himself wait for the moment when wanting did not get him killed. He cut left and right, and when it lifted its sword he went under and up and drove toward the place he had decided was a certain death's place. It was like thrusting at water that did not want to be moved, but he kept pushing, and the glass bit. The belt broke. The thing reached and touched his throat with a hand so cold Argos gasped. Then Tywald's daughter, who had chosen not to be pretty, threw him a sash of burning oil-soaked cloth, and he wrapped it where his neck had been touched and felt his skin recoil. He did not curse. He turned the blade. The other took the motion through itself and stepped back and stepped again, as if not understanding how motion had become damage. Then it went like frost goes. Argos stood, his mouth open as if taken aback by the taste of something sour. His hands wanted to shake. He decided they would not. He looked across the field and saw Aegon cut something small and useless and raise his blade and roar as if he had killed the King of Winter. He almost laughed, and then his throat ached again and would not. Rhianna Blackwood lost her master-at-arms at noon. Arden put his back to a cart and died with a look on his face like a man who has understood a joke no one told. She put her hand on his chest and told him he still owed her a lesson, and when his chest did not move she set to making a new lesson for herself that involved standing where he had stood and doing as he had done and not being ashamed that she did it worse. Jaron Mallister took a cut that bit his cheek and left his face wet in a way that made the cold look interested. He did not wipe it. He killed two and then a third with a trick he had learned from one of Sala's cousins who could make his spear a rope and his arm a pole and the ground a friend. He did not think about Seaguard and whether the sea had another trick to play there. He had learned that worrying about things far away breaks your ankle where you stand. By evening, the others fell back in numbers that made Rhianna think of flocks breaking to roost. Men shouted because that is what men do when a movement relieves pressure, as if shouting made the movement they're doing. Tywald put men to work immediately because that is what he did when anything happened. He had them lay more timber and lay it straight, not because he liked straight lines but because he liked what straight lines do to men's courage. They give it joints. Men could flex jointed courage. If you gave it to them in one rigid rod, it snapped. Issandra's son went to Argos's tent and said, "We will hold." "But what then?" Argos said. "Then we go north until we run out of letters."
Isandrès son Oded.
He wrote a letter to his mother and said, "Send the bells from the sky." The men need something to tie to their harness that makes a noise that is not theirs. He asked for bells because he remembered a winter where they had tied small bells to the eagle's legs so that in fog they would not lose one another. He had learned that the sound you make on purpose can keep you from fearing the ones you do not. He did not tell Argos that. Harrenhal sent word the next day that the Vale had cut another company. Aegon sent a reply that said, "In effect, I did not ask you to tell me what I cannot change." He sat for an hour with his hands on the arms of the carved chair and did not move. The castle made noises around him. Expansion and contraction. A sound like an old man's ridges being sanded. He thought of his father telling him the story of Harren the Black and the fire and the way this castle had grown then and had then gone on standing. He thought of the way men had become brave under that story because they thought the worst had already happened here. He thought about telling them they did not yet know the worst. He did not tell them. He went out and cut two dead things and came back and was quiet. People in their camps did what people do when time opens between fear. They cooked. They made jokes with barbs dulled with frost. They traded small things. A square of chocolate from some southern kitchen. A strip of leather softened with oil. A story about a girl in a tower whose hair went white when she looked at the sea. They shifted toward one another's fires and sat shoulder to shoulder and did not admit it was because they felt the cold less that way. They watched Salah's cousins move like water and moved like water a little themselves. Then night came like a door shutting, and there was a sound no one had words for. It made men turn to one another's faces as if to read the sound there. It was like a choir of wolves at a distance, but with the sense that some of those voices were coming from the ground under your feet. The others came, not in a sheet, not in a line, but in a haphazard scatter that fell upon gaps and then intensified there, like rot discovering the softest fruit first. It was the worst yet because it did not honor men's plan. Argos set his brothers to hold the left. They did not. One of them died fast, one died slow, one disappeared into a miz. And came out again with his hair rimed and his eyes empty of the particular kindness that had made him beloved of horses. Tywald built another wall, and his daughter scolded the men for calling it a wall, making them laugh enough that one man who had trembled stopped trembling and put his hands to work. Riala prayed to a tree that was not there. Jaren broke his blade and found another and grinned for a moment at the thought, old and boyish, that this is why you have more than one knife. Issandra's son took a blow that made his foot behave as if it belonged to someone else, and he steadied and put a hand to his horse's neck and said, "Gentle." The horse did not spook. The biters did not quite reach. Salah saw another reach for Tywald's daughter as if to be curious about what a woman's throat looked like, and she went at it in a fury that felt too large for her body. She rammed her glass in the place where Grace had taught her was the thin place, and when it answered by leaning to one side as if to suggest a dance move, she shifted and took it in mid-waver. It came apart with a sound like a blown glass bottle being shaken and cracked into pieces too fine to sweep. Tywald's daughter looked at her, and then at the spear, and then back at her, and in that look there were 3 paragraphs of gratitude taught to a tongue that did not know how to say any of them. The night took 200 men. It gave back 15 with bites that did not bleed and with eyes that grew a slow layer of hoarfrost over their color. Salah looked at one and said quietly, "No, they took him to the fire and he watched them back and did not once close his eyes to show he had a soul that slept. Then they did what had to be done, and men went away to be sick in the reeds without telling anyone they were. The word spread that the dead could be made, and men dug little deeper holes for their grief and kicked snow over them. At dawn, the others withdrew so quickly it seemed rude. They left a crispness to the air that felt like a thin compliment. Argos stood ankle-deep in cold mud and looked around and then up. Clouds were in a hurry south. He took a breath and felt his throat answer with a stiffness that was not injury and not age. It was, he decided, a message. He did not know what it said. They held for 3 more days. On the morning of the 4th, Aegon Hoare, who had been everywhere in the camp and nowhere, because he was good at being an idea instead of a man when it suited him, rode to Argos's tent with a look that belonged on another face. It was humility done badly. He sat and took off his glove and put his hand on his knee and looked at it as if it were a foreign thing he had rented for the day. "I have been the king of a lot of things," he said. "I am not the king of this. Tell me what you do when that is true." Argos blinked once. Then he was very still. He did not want to break this moment. He felt as if he were watching a bird come to a windowsill that would spook if he turned his head. You listen to the person in your camp who sees farthest in a direction you cannot. You find them by asking questions you do not want to ask. Then you obey them. And if that person is not a person with a title, Aegon said acidly, as if he sought shelter in sarcasm's small house. Then you lift them, Argos said, and did not blink now either. The ground is too cold to be proud. Aegon looked at him for a long moment, then snorted, then laughed a little, and his teeth were too many, but at least this time the laughter was for himself. "There is a girl from the bogs," he said. "Her hair lies very close to her head, greased against damp. She says things in a way that makes you do them. If I make her my general, they will make songs. The songs will be warm," Argos said. "She will be alive to hear them. That is the thing." So it was that Salah Reed stood in a ring of men who had killed kings for quarrel and took a stick and drew in the dirt in front of their boots. She drew the causeways and the ditches and the places where the ground was trustworthy and the places where it was not. She drew a series of little circles where the others paused to ask questions of the air, and she said, They do not think as we do, but they do consider. They have a rhythm. We must make a counter-rhythm. We must be noise when they are silence and silence when they are noise. We must not stand in a steady line and present them with the comfort of readily remembered motion. She laid out how they would step back, not all at once as men always want to, but in a series of polite concessions, like a dance that refuses you the step you wanted but gives you one you find you needed. She laid out where to plant fires not to be warm but to be obstacles they had to notch around. She told Tywald where to set his carts such that they would make alleys that seemed like mistakes. She told Aegon's men to use their spear points in a certain way that hurt pride because it looked like fighting beneath your arm rather than over it. She told Argos, in a voice that did not allow for the bigness of his crown, where he should stand and when he should move and when he should not turn a victory into a chase because chasing would be what the others wanted. You like to press, she said to him. You must not. They want you to prefer motion to standing because motion is where they live. You must live where you choose to. Think of yourself as mud. Think of yourself as a beaver's dam. Think of yourself as the place where the water has to think. You are the thought, not them. He listened, and his face grew suddenly smooth, and he put his hand to his throat where it had been touched. Where he had felt the wrongness put its cold finger to his pulse and seemed to consider stopping it. And he felt something he had not in many years. Someone telling him the right thing because it was right, not because it fed him. He nodded. They fought another night and another. It was better. Men died and did not die uselessly. The others did not rage, for they did not have rage. They adjusted and Sala adjusted again, and Tywald found 2 more angles he liked, and Rhiannon found 3. Isandra's son broke 2 teeth when the butt of his spear hit his face and spat them, and kept moving and later put the 2 white grains in a pouch because the mountain told him to bring them home. Aegon made himself hold a line when what he wanted was to leap. Argos made himself wait twice when what he wanted was to go. The marsh learned their names because they had become part of the way water chose to reflect the sky. Sala laughed once in the dark because she had never been so tired. On the 7th day, the wind shifted. It came from the south and wanted to go north and did not know how. You could taste its confusion like salt. The air smelled of the sea. Even here, clouds thinned as if scraped. The others moved as if thinking of elsewhere, like men with an appointment they would be late for. Sala held up a hand and felt the air on her palm and felt it answer and said, "Now." They pressed then. Not a rout. Others do not flee. A letting go. Men moved forward carefully, then carefully again, then let a small eagerness loose from its leash and ran. Argos stopped them when they ran too far. Aegon held the left like a hand closing on a last coal. Tywald sent men to pick up what had been dropped, because he knew there would be an inventory later and someone would find it easier to grieve if they had something to count. Rhiannon took Arden's place again and did not weep because she had already. Jaren looked east and wondered, for the first time in a week, if the sea had relaxed its jaw. He decided to think about it later and not be punished here for his diplomacy with waves. At dawn, the marsh lay quiet in a way that made men suspicious because quiet had been a costume worn by an enemy. They waited another day. Nothing. The dead did not come. The marsh breathed in the way Sala loved. You could feel the deep warmth with your palm again. She put her hand to earth and closed her eyes and whispered a word her mother had given her. She did not know if the earth heard her, but she liked to think it did and was not offended. Men then did what men do after fear. They began to quarrel with more vigor. Aegon wanted to say he had held the left to give himself a story inside his own mouth. Tywald wanted to say the road would be built with his money and his men and therefore he would choose the toll. Argos wanted to say that he would be the one to walk through Moat Caelin's gate first not as a conqueror but as a guest and that this would be remembered, and he was right but no one liked it. Isandra's son wanted to say nothing and did and felt himself grow old in the space it took. Sala wanted to go home and sleep on a mat of rushes and wake without reaching for glass. It went how such things go. Men nodded to one another's courage and will and went home to tell their wives the version where their decision had mattered more than the cold's whim. Argos did go to Moat Caelin. Stark met him on the causeway in mail without ornament and took his hand and held it longer than men do who only make nice. The two talked under a stoop shelter while snow freckled their shoulders and went inside and had porridge. Argos left with a promise of friendship that would last until it did not, and in spring he sent 200 men north to mend a wall where the wind had found a way through. Tywald built the road. He did it at a cost he liked and hired men who liked building better than killing, and he paid them in coin that did not lie. In 2 years, when spring returned with its smell of wet that was not rot, men took wagons north along his road and said it saved them 5 days and their horses' legs. He sat in a hall with a map and put his finger along that line and felt a shiver of ownership and pretended he did not. Rhianna Blackwood buried Arden and her dead and brought up 2 boys with a new master-at-arms who had not come into his own yet and would have to. Jaron Mallister went back to the sea. The sea tested him with 3 strange weathers, and he learned a trick for each and wrote them down for his son, who was too young to read but would be older someday. Arion Hoare went home to Harrenhal and sat in the chair and ran his hand along the smooth place and felt it catch and lifted a bit of sandpaper and made it smoother. He dreamed one night of a dragon he had never seen that made no sound at all, because when men told that story they always gave it roar and fire but never considered silence. He woke afraid and angry at his fear and called up 3 villages on the west bank of the Trident to give men to him, and they did, and he told himself that was the end of it, and it was not. Isandra Arryn sent a letter to Sala Reed in a careful hand that did not betray the fact that her pen had 3 times dipped too soon for ink because her hand had trembled a very little. The letter said only thank you. Sala put it under a stone where her mother had put her own letters. She slept. She woke one night and went to the marsh and put her hand on the earth and felt the deep warmth steady. The dead were not finished with the world. They had only, for the moment, exhausted their patience with this throat and gone to test other doors. They went into the north again, and men there met them with axes and glass and yelling that sounded like love. They went east and tasted salt and did not like the taste because it was crude and jealous and made the mouth tight. They went west and discovered that rock is hard when it has lions carved into it, because the men in those halls do not let their walls sleep. They learned as men do. They kept learning. In years after, men told the story differently, depending on where they liked to hear themselves named. In Dorne, the version with Nymer's chest full of obsidian grew a new lock each retelling until the chest could not be opened without 7 hands. In the Vale, Isandra's son's 2 white teeth became 3, and sometimes a whole handful that he had spat and then caught in his palm and offered as proof of his courtesy even under duress. In the Riverlands, Rhialla's arithmetic became more elegant and less bloody. In the Stormlands, Argos did not mention the moment in Arion's mouth when humility had sat there and looked lost. He spoke of road and of dust. In the West, Tywald's road lasted through floods and was breached twice and repaired 3 times, and then men forgot who had paid for it and remembered only the toll. Sala Reed had children who learned to move like water and to listen to wind and to hold glass without letting it slip and to touch the earth with a palm and feel its mood. When they asked her what the other's eyes looked like, she said, "Old water in a pail with ash stirred in. Not frightening until you think what it means. And then only frightening if you think you are the only thing alive." She told them this too. Since there was no one king, we had to ask one another for each thing. It is harder that way and more humiliating and more human. A crown can make gratitude seem like a sign of weakness. No crown teaches please and thank you with teeth at your throat. I am glad for that lesson. I am tired of it. Westeros stayed divided. Each king kept his own old hearth and added another stone to it and believed that stone would keep out winter. None of them was wrong. None of them was right. When the next hard season came, men went to the neck again and stood on the cold stones and remembered the sound wrongness makes when it moves. Tywald's road made a line through that remembering and bound it to other roads. The marsh took and gave. One night, years later, Sala stood where she had first seen the one with the belt. A fog lay in a dish between 2 hummocks, and in it a fox turned and turned until it lay down to look like a handful of leaves. She put her hand to the earth and felt, as she had then, the slow warmth. She tasted air. It was wrong only in its hunger, and hunger is a kind of rightness. She blew the little horn. Far off, a cousin answered. Then another. The bells hung on their cords and chattered to one another as wind found them. There was no glimmer. She did not miss it. She did not long for the hot taste of terror and victory that had made her feel like her skin fit too tightly. She did not miss anything. She stood on the causeway stone that had known the blunt edges of 1,000 boots and 12 king's horses, and she put her hand on her spear and felt the glass cool against her palm, and she said, "To the marsh and to the memory of men who had stood here with her and died, we will do it again. We will do it until the end of names." The marsh did not answer, which was its way. A loon called, and the call ran along the water until it hit a wall of alder and slid down it and was swallowed. In her mouth, on the back of her tongue, she felt the taste of iron and old smoke. She smiled at it because she had learned to be polite to that taste, and it had learned politeness in return. She turned and walked toward the lights of men's campfires, which had the color of peaches when you saw them from far enough away. Behind her, the reeds lifted and nodded, silent people. North, south, west, east, the kingdoms kept their names and their pride, and learned, under the press of weathers that forgot them, to send 2 birds where one would do. Men who could not bend took longer to die. Men who did bent almost to breaking and rose again while their joints remembered for them. In their halls, kings aged, and in their bells, children's laughter made notes that sounded sometimes like fear and sometimes like courage, depending on who listened. The raven trees wore blood in winter and rust in spring, and did not tell anyone how many lives they had heard pass beneath them. They did not need to. The sound of the causeway made a counting that satisfied any god interested in sums. Riala Blackwood hair streaked to white and did not hide it. She went once to Seagard in summer and sat on Jaren's wall and watched the sea flatter itself and friends flatter one another. He had a son then who ran along the parapet and put stones into his mouth to suck the salt. Jaren scolded him and then laughed and picked him up, and it seemed to Riala that men sometimes did learn. Tywalt died in a late summer with his hands on a map and a smile that meant he had found a new improvement he would not live to inflict. His daughter, who had become formidable without ever becoming less kind, built a little shrine out by the road's edge with stones the marsh gave her. Argos died in his tent of an infection brought on by a cut that would not have killed a lesser man, because a lesser man would not have put his throat where glass and cold could kiss it. Arion Hoare died in Harrenhal, having outlived 2 wives and his favorite horse and everything but his own imperfection. The chair needed smoothing still when they carried him out, and he did not like that. Isandra Arryn put her son in her chair and stood behind him 3 years, and then one day she went out onto the high balcony, and the bee in her chest settled under her hand, and she sat down very polite and did not stand up again. They said the mountain had kept her company every night of her life, and it had come at last to ask for silence. She had given it words enough. As for Sala Reed, the children of her children sat at her feet in summer with marsh wine in their mouths and caught eels with their hands, and then let them go because they liked the way their skins slipped through their fingers. She told them the story she did not like to tell and laughed when they asked for it again. She told them, briefly, how she had stood before kings and Dra. In the dirt, and how the dirt had not cared that her stick was in a queen's hand or a child's. She did not tell them she had sometimes felt lonely afterward, when men went away to their halls and their wives and their crowns and their ways of talking. She did not need to. The marsh knew. It would hold that for her when she forgot. One winter, not as hard as the hard one, she woke to a wind that smelled of fish and regret. She went out and stood again with her hand in the earth. She heard a sound on the horizon like bells. She waited for it to be the bells of the Vale's birds and knew it was not. It was only ice cracking. It was only winter insisting on its right to be the world's oldest song. She blew the horn, and someone answered her. The marsh fires burned low in their blue tongues and snapped and curled to embers. The air moved sideways. The reeds hissed beneath their blades. She smiled into the wrongness and the rightness and lifted her glass spear and went to sea. She had never wanted to be the first or the last. She wanted to be one of a number. That was what the marsh meant by love. That was what Westeros meant, too, when it bothered to. In a world where no single crown had taught men manners through terror and convenience, men sometimes found them anyway by licking frost off one another's lips and saying, "Here, your mouth will freeze if you do not." The song needed a lot of voices. It always had. There was no conductor. There was only a rhythm. Sala kept it the way she kept her breath, one note, then another. The bells on the cords above the hummocks had crusted with salt blown in from a wind that had changed its mind twice between sunrise and noon. Sala Reed stood with the cold in her cheekbones and watched the marsh make a new face out of thin ice. She had learned to hear the wrongness without fear and to greet it the way she greeted a familiar illness, by laying out her medicines in order and setting a stool near the fire. When the wind slanted sideways, her fingers moved without her. She lifted the little horn, trilled once, then dropped it again before an answer could quite reach her. This time the sound that came back was not a cousin's voice and not a loon's. It was a human cough curled in a scarf. A caravan nosed into sight along the causeway, careful-footed horses picking the timbers as if they were tasting them. Sala knew the first beast by its harness, the leather darkened with oil that smelled of citrons, the bells flat and hammered thin, the ribbons in the reins crimson as coals. Dawn had come north again, and they came the way they always did, carrying the heat of their kitchens inside their cloaks. The leader swung down from the saddle with a grace too warm for the air. She was small and strong and wore her headscarf carelessly, as if trusting the wind not to be impolite enough to lift it. Her palms were nicked with thin scars the shape of glass. She put those hands together and bowed not like a lady at court, but like a potter acknowledging another craft. "Prince Nymer sends me," she said. "My name is Ileana Sand. I bring obsidian, which is only glass until the world asks it to be more." Sala took her in. The skins of water slung low, the chests lashed twice to keep them from bouncing. The two camels brought for their patience and their humor. "I've a place where stone likes to give us teeth," she said. "Yours will sit well there." She touched the woman's wrist. "How far did you come without sleeping?" 2 days and a night, Ileana said, and smiled as if confessing to desert. "The road your lion lays made it quicker, but my camels do not like planks. They prefer sand that remembers them." "They'll know this soon enough," Sala said. "The marsh remembers everything you make it learn." They took the chests to a place only marshfolk guessed at, where an old seam in the earth pushed up black shards with rain. Sala showed Ileana how to sing to the stone so that it broke with clean faces, and Ileana showed Sala how to scrape away the oil sheen that sometimes lay on the new glass like a scum and made it brittle. They worked in a companionable silence, the way women do when they are making something that will save lives and do not care for flattery about it. At dusk, Sala led Ileana to a little house made of reeds that had learned to sit still. There was a skin hung at the door, and the air inside had the smell of fish and green things dried and pounded. Ileana sat with her back to a basket of apples that had gone wrinkled with storage and listened while Sala told the marsh news. 6 spear points broken and replaced, 2 boys bitten by cold and now scolded by their grandmother for showing their pride, a raft sunk deliberately to keep Ironborn from stealing it and later raised by cousins who had taken a fancy to its rope. "Prince Nymer says you will make this place a market if you are not careful," Ileana said lazily. "He will open a stall on your causeway and sell glass for gossip." "He can trade with my aunt for both," Sala said. "But tell him to bring his sister again if he wants to sell anything dear." The last time she came north, she bought 3 barrels of frog hearts, and he pretended to scold her and paid twice what they were worth with a grin he could not hold shut. "They make a broth of them in the Shadow City," Ileana said, smiling. "Lovers drink it to learn patience." "There are easier things to drink," Sala said, and reached to flip the fish in the pan. Before dawn, she woke to a deep quiet that did not belong to sleep. She lay very still, her breath shallow enough that it did not push warmth into the air above her lips. In the quiet, there was the memory of bells. Not the marsh chords and not the vale's polished chimes. A bigger bell, a slow one. She sat up and smiled without wanting to, because something in her loved a sound like that. It was the sound men made when they put the IR hands on a ship's rail and looked east. "The lake," she told Ileana, who had woken with a hand on the knife tied to her thigh. "The god's eye." Ileana was still. "What makes that bell?" "The ice," Sala said, swinging her legs over the low edge of the bed and feeling for her boots. "When it grows in a hurry, it calls to itself." They were on the causeway with the camels before noon, the marsh unrolling before them like a book with damp pages. Sala's cousins moved the way marsh water does when it is not sure whether to freeze or flow, gathering, letting go, gathering. Ileana stood in her stirrups once to see over the winter reeds and laughed, in delight not mockery, at the way the land decided to be land in pieces and then changed its mind between steps. By the time they reached the river, the word had run along both banks and under the ice and up into trees where old crows said it back to one another as if practicing a prayer. The gods, I had a film over it, thin in some places, thick in others, and you could see the white lines of stress like writing a child had tried to rub out and written over again. The island lay in its center like an eye within an eye, its trees standing up against a sky that looked back. Rhiannon Blackwood reached the lake as the sun slid and was surprised into laughter at the sight of the winter villages that had sprung up since she sent her last letter. Tents here and here, 2 camps sharing a smoke. Carts backed in together with the wheels braced. Little middens politely hidden in one direction. 3 fires in a line, not a circle. It had been a long time since she had seen so many banners without those banners immediately snarling. She cut that thought before it could sour her pleasure. She was old enough to find contentment in a quiet she had not been promised. Jaron Mallister arrived after her, his face scraped free of beard, his hair washed clean and combed backward with something that made it lie obediently. He came not because Seagard had ceased needing him, but because he had a debt to the river itself and to a woman who had once stood with him on a bridge and made his life easier with one sentence. He found Rhiannon standing on a boulder as if it had been raised for her, her finger in the air drawing lines men could not see until she had drawn them twice. "This is as far as we go," she said. "We do not set foot on the isle. If any of you cannot keep your feet from wandering across ice for curiosity, I will cut your curiosity out of you and feed it to a swan." "The swans will refuse," Jaron said. "They are proud that way. They are. I like them," Rhiannon said. Then, because she was that sort of woman, she looked at him and let warmth enter her face. "It is good you came. Seagard put on her fur and told me to be back before she needed me to change the water in her wash basin," he said. "Do you ever tire of making the sea into a wife?" Rhiannon said. "Only when she is crueler than my mistakes," Jaron said, and bowed in the style she hated and forgave him for because it made his knees crack. Tywald's daughter rode into camp with her cloak thrown back and her head held like a woman who has learned to put the world on her hair. Jenna Lannister was what men called her to her face because they did not want to scatter the feints she made by changing names. She looked at the ice at the island, at the men gathered and the angles where carts could be made to break an advancing line, and she smiled, tired and ready. The road builders came with her. Men with backs they had learned to straighten beneath loads and shoulders that knew where to store ache. Behind them, and separate, came the black banners of Harrenhal. Rhiannon's mouth thinned because she knew she would have to make room in her patience for a man whose father deserved few seats at any table. Goran Hor had his grandsire's chin and none of his lift. He rode with his cloak pinned with a piece of iron beaten into the shape of a crown and hammered with bits of glass that caught light only when he turned as if by accident and always when he meant. He had inherited Aerion's chair and his love of being a chair in other men's rooms, and Rhiannon could not afford to hate him for the shape of his mouth. Isandra's sun came down from the high road later, the bells tied to his men's harness making gentler noises than the lake's big song. Ronald Arryn had shoulders he knew how to carry and a mind that tasted words before he let them go. He set his camp in a way that let people pass through it without feeling they had broken a boundary. He sat alone on a stool and wrote a letter he did not seal, then drew it through the air as if testing its balance and tore it in half and fed it to the brazier. There are thoughts the mountain keeps even when you have no paper. From the south, with banners that looked like sun cut into cloth, came men from the Reach. They did not bring their king. Mern loved his orchards and his tall chair too much in winter to be moved. He sent his steward, a dark-eyed man named Harlan Tyrell, whose fingers had the look of green a man wears inside when he has handled leaves all morning. Harlan brought bread and wine and expressed regret that his king could not come in a voice that made you think his king had been in the next room and would walk through the door any moment. He found Tywald's daughter and exchanged a look with her that settled an old question with a nod. Dorne's envoy had arrived with Sala. Old Town sent 3 maesters who came with hands tucked in their sleeves and the good habit of watching their feet, so they did not step where a line of droppings that did not belong to horses warned you not to. Dragonstone sent no men but sent a letter rolled thin and tied with thread dyed in storm blue. Balon Targaryen had drawn a picture at the bottom of the page. Not of a dragon, as men always hoped he would, but of a wave's back. Ash. He had written under it, "Here is what you must look like when you want to be stronger than what is on you." Rhiannon gave the page to Sala Reed to keep. She liked to think of it in marsh hands. Night fell with its old trick of bringing the wrong season at once. The lake sang again as the ice thickened, a deep sound that seemed to come from a place under your sternum and make your own ribs answer in kind. The men shifted the way horses shift when they smell river. The others did not show themselves then. They came at dawn without glory and without subtlety, along 3 tongues of ice where the cold had worked most greedily in the night and made corridors of solid that could bear weight. Sala saw them first because she had risen before any bell and gone to stand with her knees about to numb and her hands in her sleeves. She lifted the horn and put air through it once and again, and men who had been beginning to lift bowls to their mouths set them down and took up glass. Rhiannon stood up on her stone and began to point. Jenna turned and said 3 words to her carpenters, and they took up axes not to fight with but to lever with. Jaren drew one long breath because he had learned that 3 short ones made his next arrow dip. They came like this, shadows inside frost. They did not hurry because they did not need to. They could, if they wanted, stand in the wind and let it take the heat out of men while they waited. This morning they did not wait. That was good. Waiting made men doubt themselves. Motion gave men something to meet. Ronald Arryn rode his hawks where the ice was thick and took his men off their horses and made them run the length of a banner twice with their harness on, as if to remind them what their legs were for. He put the bells to work. The marshmen had taught him that sound made on purpose steadies the hand. His men rang them softly at first and then harder as the dead came near, and each man could hear his neighbor the way a swimmer hears a singer above. Gorenhor's men moved well under men who knew their oars and their ropes. Ironborn are better in boats than in boots, but winter makes you learn new skills whether you want to or not. They took the left and made a shallow arc that would, if they held, keep the wrongness from the reeds. Jenna set her wagons so they made alleys that could be closed with one pull. Her carpenters began to heave heated stones out of braziers into slings that would drop them onto the ice and crack it in fans. Sala's people slid out along the margins where a goose could walk and a man must wade, and laid little pots of tar to light in case the line faltered. When it met everywhere at once. Steel did almost nothing but break, which is a comfort if you are the sort of man who prefers not to rely on things you can see. Obsidian cut the way memory cuts. It made a sound at every true touch that Sala knew well enough now to hear inside her bones. The dead did what they had learned to do at the causeway. They pushed into gullies. They covered their spears with what looked like a fine cloth, but was only cold made thin so that obsidian sometimes slid off instead of biting. The living did what Sala had taught them. They gave ground by not giving ground all at once. They built not a wall but a long, patient hand. 3 times the lake sang and 3 times men flinched because the sound made their ribs complain. The 3rd time, the ice under Goren's men shifted with the heavy indignation of an old plank being asked to hold 3. Jaren saw it and sent one of Tywald's heated stones to find the seam. It landed with a noise that made thin cracks shoot out like frightened spiders and then widen. Goren's leftmost rank went down. They did not scream, for the water took the breath from them greedily, and their armor dragged them under with the touch of a lover making a mistake. The gap yawned. The dead moved with that precise joy that is not joy, and Sala saw where she had to be. She moved without thought, which is not to say without reason. 2 cousins went with her because the marsh's math requires a cord. She went out onto the new ice and felt it argue. She put her spear into the hand of a man she did not know, and he set his boot against it and she pushed back, and the spear asked the sky a question and came down satisfied. They closed the gap not with bodies but with insistence, and 3 men died holding it while men who sang the bells moved up. Rhiannon watched that hinge and made her next 5 choices accordingly. She sent men where they would die because they had insisted on being born into a time like this and because there was no other arithmetic that would sum. She saw Gorenhor try to pull his men back without making it look like retreat, and she did not let him. Not because she enjoyed his pain, but because a man's pride is a hole you fall through and drown in when the ground is this thin. She sent one of her own boys, a good boy whose father had died in her service, to stand by Goran and speak in his ear in that sing-song marsh cadence that men find themselves obeying before they remember they meant to argue. Ronal Arryn saw the rightmost tongue of ice begin to split under the weight of the cold and threw his men into a shallow V, open to the island. They formed on their knees and rang and held their bells above their heads when the spray froze on their gauntlets so that sound would continue. Jenna's heated stones made small fireworks when they hit, singing and sinking and leaving holes that confused memory. These wrong ones did not bleed, but they made a sound that was a little like a sigh when they went down through the cracks. If you heard it at night, you would wake and think you had heard your mother. The lake held. The island did not ask for their feet. On that island, among the weirwoods, the faces stayed silent. The men who stood along the edge thought they felt the heads stir. And once, together, Sala stood with her breath hard in her mouth and looked into the eyes of a white face and saw their only memory and could not tell if the face made any of it easier. She did not want help from a tree. She wanted friction. She drew her spear along her sleeve, feeling it drag, and went back into the press. By noon, the light had thickened. The dead moved differently then. They had been precise. Now they were insistent. They began to turn their heads toward the island. Not to go but to mark. Rhianna did not like the way their helmets tipped, one after another, like a line of women acknowledging a bride. She began to send men to crack the ice in an arc, to take the possibility of a straight path away. The carpenters swore and swung. The maesters made a neat fire in a brazier that was a little wheel and rolled it along the edge, its flames licking at air it did not need. The Ironborn bent to levers with that good willingness men have when they are out of their element and want very badly to be in it again. When the others began to fall back, not in disorder, but with the very tidy meanness of a man leaving a party early and taking his laughter with him, Jaron Mallister did what he had sworn he would not and took 3 steps farther than he had been told to take. There are men in every battle who cannot help hunting the last cut. A shadow turned toward him with a sword slender as a made-up promise. He turned with it and could not find purchase for his boot. He went to his knee. It began to lift its blade for the place where his spine pressed his skin. Sala saw, moved, and the world forked. In one branch, Jaron died quietly, and in another he lived to tell a story that did not embarrass him. She took the spear at an angle, and she did it in a way she had not taught others because she had not thought she would teach that cutting to anyone. It felt like reaching into the dark behind your grandmother's chair and finding a dog that had never come into your house and putting your hand into its mouth and pulling something glass out of it. The point entered the thing under the arm and slid. The icy parry it tried to make turned the cut against itself. It shattered, and the shards sank with a whisper. Jaron rolled, unhappy with his own oldness, and rose, ashamed and grateful. He did not say thank you until night, when he found her and said the word into the reed music and did not need her to answer. By dusk, the lakeside one last long note and then fell quiet. The dead had gone. They had pressed and measured and stepped back, like a jeweler testing a ring he had not quite polished. Men counted again. 400. They wrote it down so the number would not have to live in their mouths. Ronald told his bells to hush. Jenna set her men to their food and then to their wheels. Goran Hor went to his tent and smoothed a piece of wood with his thumb the way his father had smoothed a chair. Rhianna stood and looked at the island until her eyes watered and she had to pretend it was the smoke. The council came that night because no one had energy left to quarrel loudly. They met in a long tent Jenna had ordered put up that afternoon when she saw that tents would have to speak to one another as well as men. It was warmed with stones pulled from a hearth and wrapped in cloth. Sala stood at the back and kept her hands beneath her arms to catch heat and felt the marsh on her skin like an old song. Ronal Arryn did what he had meant to do before he had left his mountain. He said nothing until others had spoken. Harlan Tyrell spoke with a voice that had watered gardens and fed towns. He made a neat row of reasonable words that ended with the phrase common burden, and Rhianna heard in it what she had hoped to hear. Jenna spoke next and did not ask for coin. She asked for stone and wood and men to lay the road through the next steady now that winter had shown them where it broke and where it held. She asked to build wayhouses where marsh folk would be paid to lay down mats and a stew for men who were not their cousins. "It will be my men's hands and my coin," she said, "and your names on the placards. I can make a better bargain out of bragging rights than out of tithes. Gorenhor smirked at the notion of Tywald's blood spending coin for another man's name, and then realized he had smirked too obviously and lifted a cup to hide it. And Sala spoke, which made 3 men stop chewing and 2 maesters put their heads up like hounds catching scent. She said, "You like to give titles for work. Give none here. Give a place." She put her finger on the part of the map where the causeways nodded. "Make this ground neutral. Do not call it yours when you ride upon it. Build a house not for kings but for messengers. Give them food and a place to leave letters, and pay the marsh to grow old in it." She looked at each man and saw his pride pinch his mouth and leave, because pride knows when to go out into the cold and cool off. Ronald rose then, because someone had to turn a song into parchment. "We will write it," he said. "We will sign it at the causeway head. We will send 2 birds with copies to every hall where men can set their names. We will call it." He hesitated, and the bells on his men's harnesses made a faint sound as the wind nagged at the tent walls. "We will call it the Bell. No, the Bell Compact is too pretty. We will call it the Causeway Compact, and inside it there will be a bell." Men laughed and then, hearing their laughter, looked at one another as if making sure it had been good noise. Jenna bent and wrote with the same sure hand she had when she made columns of numbers behave. Harlan's fingers were steady as a man who has grafted trees and wants his fruit to take. Gorenhor signed with a flourish and a scowl, and it was the first useful thing he had done in 6 months. Riala did not sign. She took the quill, looked at it, and gave it to Sala. "Uel, Eve here," she said. "We visit." Sala held the quill without moving. She had not signed her name to anything but a child's rune on a reed mat. The ink was thick and black and remembered the hand that had stirred it. She set the quill to the vellum and made marks that were not quite letters and were her name anyway. The tent felt her do it and did not try to pretend it had not. They went back to their camps with the air inside them scratchy from too many voices. Men slept, and the lake was only lake again. In the morning, Riala took her people to the nearest village and put a cup of hot milk into the hands of a girl whose brother had died and smiled while the girl wept, because the best thing a lord can do is give someone permission to have their feelings in the right order. Jaren took his archers out onto the ice and made them listen to it sing until they stopped flinching. Jenna's wagon men began to test timbers for their new road and swore in a way that meant they felt lucky to be asked to do it. Gorenhor sent a letter to Harrenhal that said nothing and a long sigh to the sky that did not answer him. Ronald Aaron sent 2 bells with messengers to the wall and wrote a note to the Lord Commander that said, in its tidy lines, "This will not warm you, but it will make a sound that reminds you of someone." In Old Town, a maester named Vaildren read the letter that had come on thread dyed in storm blue and sighed because Balon Targaryen wrote sentences in which weather behaved like a man and men behaved like weather. He wrote back anyway because letters need to go back where they came from to keep their dignity. Balon took the reply to the window where he had once hung storms and smiled. He was old now, which is to say he had learned the pleasure of boiling porridge, but the wind in his hair still made him feel briefly important. He wrote to Sala Reed and drew for her a small device that would slide obsidian flakes down into a cleft and keep fingers from opening under cold. He wrote to Ronald and said he had said the right word. He wrote to Nymer Martell and thanked him for the blue thread with a warmth that made the prince rub his lip thoughtfully and decide to send more. Winter softened. It does this as an insult. It lifted its weight from the riverbanks and let cartwheels turn without remark. And men forgot to offer thanks aloud because they were already thinking of the price of grain. In western halls, they hung the wording of the Causeway Compact in places where men would have to see it and read it and argue with it over wine. In the Stormlands, the new king, Argos's brother Edric, sat with the paper under his hand and read the clause that made the causeway neutral 3 times and then smiled because he saw the game in it. He had never been good with his mouth when it made speeches. He was good with a straight line drawn on a map and the quiet hour after dawn when the men who will not speak plainly are still asleep. He wrote to Jenna and thanked her for pretending not to own the road she had paid for. He wrote to Gorenhor and was politely humiliating. He wrote to Ronald and engaged precisely. He wrote to the north and asked nothing but sent beer and a brace of quail. He learned that gifts play better than requests. In the Riverlands, Rhiannon Blackwood set herself to the tedious work of making sure Lothar Fry did not find a way to tax the compact twice and keep the money. She sat in the twins for 4 days, endured 3 jokes about geese and 1 about ladders, and left with a paper that said in 10 lines what had taken her 20 years to arrange. Fry would take this and not that. He would pretend what she wanted him to pretend. He would send a goose to Raventree every year on the day the first snow stuck. If he failed, he would send 2 the next, and so on. She put the paper in her sleeve and made herself a promise of a nap in a chair that had room for all her bones. Jaron Mallister went home to Seaguard and found the sea had remembered how to be liquid without asking permission. He took a boat with a bottom shaped like a duck and went out into water that had the color of hammered pewter and held his breath when a line of foam came toward him with the straight spine of a soldier. He let it pass. He spoke to the fishermen who had watched him and taught 2 of them the knot he had learned from a man in the neck whose fingers could make 4 loops into a knot without looking. Then he sent a letter to Rhiannon that told her nothing and everything and ended with a sentence that said, "If you ever tire of that chair, come and sit in my tower and tell me about the first time your son took a spear into his hand." Dorne kept sending obsidian. Nymer Martell liked the way generosity traveled faster than orders. Ileana came twice that spring and once in a summer when dragonflies stuck to her scarf as if it were a kind of sky they preferred. She and Sala learned each other's mother's recipes and laughed when they could not make their hands do what their mother's hands had done. Ileana taught Sala to wear an anklet that made a whisper when she walked. Sala taught Ileana how to walk without leaving a mark at all. When Ileana left the 3rd time, she put her palm to Sala's cheek and said, "If the sea freezes true, send for me. I want to walk on it and then tell my children I am a liar." It was a good spring for a while. That was suspicious and kind. Men planted. The roads moved. Jenna Lannister built her wayhouses and hired marsh girls to fill pots with thin stew that tasted like leeks and secrets. She sat once at a rough table with a crannogman who would not say his name and handed him a cup and felt, for the first time since her father died with his hand on a map, that she had done something that would keep standing briefly after her heart fell silent. She wrote to Edric Durandon and teased him about his miserly letters. She wrote to Harlan Tyrell and told him that if he sent her 1 more cask of a sweet wine she did not love, she would go to Highgarden and pick every fruit he planned to sell and eat 2 out of 3. She wrote to Ronald Arryn and asked for bells. And in the north, the Lord of Winterfell, Edwine Stark, a man whose hair had gone iron gray early and made people respect him sooner than they would have, went to his gate and met a woman with grease on her cheek and glass under her fingernails. He took in her hands before her words and closed both of his around them and said, in his careful, even way, "I owe you a debt, and I will never know its exact measure. Come in and tell me only the piece that keeps you lighter by telling it." Sala went in and told him about the bell and the compact and the way the ice sounds when it is young and hurrying. She told him what she wanted from him. Not soldiers and not promises. She wanted 3 dozen boys sent to the neck when the mushrooms fruited to learn how to lift their feet without offending the marsh. "Send me a Stark," she said, because she had a sense of theater and because she had a kindness for the pride of old houses. Edwine sent his 2nd son, who had a scar on his chin from trying to make a dog sit when the dog was older than he and just as determined. The summer made a long room and filled it with dust and a low buzzing that made men lazy in the afternoon. It was then that the ice did its rudeness. It made itself quick in places where sea should always argue. Up near salt pans the tides turned in their beds and did not get up. Boats sat with their bellies cradled by something they had never trusted and had never expected to hold them. Ironborn, who had known since their teeth came in how to make shallow boats move like snakes, found that snakes in this season froze in place if they took the wrong breath. They cursed and learned to carry sledges and cursed again. A small party left Pike with the idea of crossing the short sea to the Cape with their knives between their teeth. 3 of them reached the middle and the ice side and took them into its mouth, and they went under without a ripple. The one who lived went home and burned his own boat for the warmth of the story he needed to tell. Goran Hor scowled at every window in Harrenhal and wrote a letter to Rhiannon Blackwood that managed to ask for help without saying please. The gods I held by its own whim that winter. The compact worked. Men came and went. The bell house at the causeway grew a habit of being there. Marsh girls put their names on a board. Men took them down with respect because the handwriting did not ask forgiveness. The Night's Watch sent down a man with a black cloak white with salt and a voice like a pick on stone. He told them, with no apology for the heaviness of his words, that the dead had come again to the Weeper, to Last Hearth's high fields, to the long straight shape of the King's Road where it ran too clean. He took back a chest of glass and a handful of bells and a letter from Ronald that said, "Thank you for doing all the work no songs will love you for. There is no lesson in weather beyond humility. It will break you when you think you have bowed enough. It will pass over you when you are ready to be heroic." Sala learned again to live in the rhythm of wake and watch. She kept the horn near her mouth. She kept her spear near her hip. She kept her stories near her teeth and her anger where it belonged. On the ground, under a heavy stone she could lift when it was necessary. Her first grandchild was born with a mouth that looked like it had remembered someone else's name and could not let go of it. She put her finger into that mouth and let herself be bitten and laughed. Goran Hor did a foolish thing in the sort of way men do when they have never had anyone look at them with soft eyes while they were crying and tell them to hush. He tried to sail a thin-skinned craft across the god's eye to show his men what courage looked like on ice. He got halfway and then thought better of it and tried to turn. The ice spoke its slow word. The boat became a skin in a butcher's shop, wet and useless. The crown of hammered iron and glass went into the water and climbed onto a fish head and leaned there ironically in the weeds until spring, when a boy from a hamlet saw it and put it on his dog and ran about the yard and laughed while his mother pulled it off and scolded him and then hid it in a chest and later sold it to a carter for a kiss. Goran lived and hated himself a little more, which would have been good for him if he had had the sort of character that can turn that into kindness. Edric Durandon drilled his men on the marches and used his road to send help to small villages whose names only men who live long and humbly will remember. He put a hand to a little boy's head and gave him the sort of blessing men give when they want to bless themselves for still being capable of feeling. He wrote a letter to Ronald Arryn to say that he had considered marrying a second wife and had decided against it. Ronald wrote back to say that the mountain sometimes must take snow with it if it is to come down safely, which was a way of saying that women are not obligations. Edric laughed when he read it and remembered that it is useful to know men who speak sideways. Jenna Lannister traveled her road in person once that season. She put her hand to every support post of every way house. If a timber sounded sullen, she had it changed. At the second way house north of the Millwater, a man in a gray cloak pressed a cup into her hand and said it was on the house because his house lived because of it. She said, "No, it is not," and paid him in coin anyway. She went into the marsh once because Sala had asked her to, and let a reed woman teach her where to step and where not to. She came out with boots that would not forgive her for the knowledge she had forced into them, and a grin men had not seen on H. Since the summer she had learned to climb the tower wall with her older brother and had never admitted to their mother. She wrote to Harlan Tyrell and told him that the marsh grew a flower that looked like a woman's stomach and that one day she would send him a bunch of them and he could give them to his king. Harlan wrote back to say that King Mern preferred apples, but he would learn to appreciate bellies. Balon Targaryen did what he had decided he could do better than anyone else left living in his house. He wrote things down. He had Old Valyrian on his tongue sometimes when he woke, and he would speak to the air until the taste went away, then translate what he could remember for men who hated to think that any sentence might not be in the common tongue. He wrote a treatise on weather that compared ice to manners and sent it to the Citadel. He wrote a list of ways to keep fingers from going white in the wrong way while holding glass. He wrote a letter to Sala Reed's grandchild on the occasion of her birth that said, "You will be taught to move like water and that is good, but do not forget you may also be stone." He wrote to Nymer Martell and drew him the little device again with an improvement that had come to him when he could not sleep, because his daughter was singing in the corridor to make her daughter sleep. The others came again, but not on the god's eye that winter. They went north and east, and there they found men who had learned as well as they had. They came down a valley not 2 days west of White Harbor where the snow lies with the confidence of a princess, and were charged by Manderley men who had sharpened pigs' bones into spikes and tied bells to their belt loops so they would not forget that sound. The dead did not triumph there. They looked at their lesson and went away to find a more congenial schoolroom. They came to Last Hearth again and met boys Sala had taught to lift their feet. The boys were not heroes. They were not even brave in any way that would be sung. They were careful, and careful is a kind of love you can give to your brothers or your field or your dog. The dead tripped on careful and could not believe it. They got up and tried again and found fish's bones in their path and were confused. Spring came with less confidence than men wished. The sea held its guilt in it like salt. Men disassembled their tents and took them home for moths to consider. Riala Blackwood went to see the first bud open on the raven tree and did not ask it for anything. Jenna went home and argued with a mason about how to build a staircase in a tower that had not wanted to be climbed in that direction. She won. Ronald Aaron sat with his mother's chair at his back and wrote letters to children whose fathers had died on the ice and told them not stories, not lies, but small things. Your father ate in my tent and took his bread with his 2 fingers as if afraid he would pinch it. Your father told a joke I will not write because it was bad. Your father stood where he was told and the bell helped him know where to step. People need to know their dead stood where they were told. Edric Durandon went out to stand in rain and did not like the way it had forgotten him. Balon painted a little wave that looked like laughter and was surprised by his own hand. What the gods I remembered, it kept. Men told each other that once in deep night the faces on the isle had moved and pressed their lips together in a way that said no. No one could prove it. Riala believed it because she liked to think that trees remembered the first time a woman had refused to give up her child. Sala did not believe it because she did not need trees to do her work for her. The marsh sang like a kettle. The road took men where they needed to go or where they wanted to go. The compact made a little space in men's heads where something generous could live without dying of ridicule. When the sea laughed at Seaguard with too many teeth, Jaren answered by lighting a line of twine and making it fall in burning lips. When Ironborn came on sledges with new insolence, he had a line of caltrops laid like a prayer answered by a different god. He wrote it all down and did not expect anyone to read it who had not been asked to keep a city. The year turned, and then another. Riala's hair went all white. Jenna's did not. She had her father's stubborn gold. Ronald went thin and stayed strong. Edric grew a little belly and decided it was the price of staying kind when men came asking for 1 more bag of barley. Balin's daughters sent him a cup etched with waves, and he used it even when the water inside tasted like a boy's bath. Nymer wrote a letter full of gossip and Sala's eyes went round with her mouth. She laughed and kept it. And then, because this story would have been a lie otherwise, winter returned with a mood that felt like a test. It came not with sideways wind, but with a long, straight breath that laid itself down over the neck and stayed. Sat. Sala woke with the wrongness in her teeth, the old familiar itch in the palm, and got up without making the sound a woman makes when her joints ask a price. She went outside and heard no bells. She lifted hers and rang it once, and the sound hung as if the air did not know what to do with it. She smiled. "All right," she said, and found her spear. Ronald heard it in the airy, the way a mountain hears a sound carried up through the valley. Not the bell itself, but a kindness toward it. He stood and said, "We go." And his men were already on their feet and making their buckles go through the right holes. Edric felt it in his sleep and dreamed of a creature with a long back and did not fear it. He woke with his hand on the blanket and said, "Send to the march." And someone in his hall was already doing it. Jenna was bent over a table drawing a new lever that would let a small man move a big thing without shame. She looked up and simplified a W. With a stroke, which is what courage is. Riala had been dozing in her chair and her head snapped upright, and she said to no one, "Hush," as if fear were a child somewhere in the hall. Jaren went onto the wall and the sea was not there, and that, too, was a word from winter. Took a day to gather. It had been built into their blood now, the way of going toward the place where the world narrows. The bell house had fire in its belly when Sala arrived. She took down the list from the board and signed her mark next to it, and then went outside and put her hand into the earth. It answered with a stealthy warmth, the way a body that loves you answers your hand when there is anger between you and you touch anyway. They did not need a counsel. They had their work. They put Jenna's levers together and tested them with stones. They walked the ice at the lake's margin and listened to its mood. They tied bells to harness and then tied a larger one to a post at the bell house and told a boy to ring it when he was afraid. Within an hour he had learned the difference between ringing when frightened and ringing because he loved the feel of his palms sting. Ronald made his men run with harness, and they did and did not think him cruel. Edric set his lines and had them bend and breathe and bend again. Riala took a cup of milk out to the woman whose boy would ring and said, "You may cry until sunset and then you must stop, because the night is a thief and it will take more from you if you cry when it comes." At dawn, the ice sang and answered itself, and the dead came with a deliberation that felt like a pause between one sentence and the next. They came not along the left and not the right, but along the middle where no one had wanted them to. Sala found herself smiling, a small, fierce thing. The middle is where she lived. She put her spear into that space and made herself the smallest hinge. This time she thought they would not learn to like the sound. This time, if she could teach it to anyone, she would teach the dead to hesitate. She would give winter back to the sky. She would give men to their beds with their wives and their dogs and their bread. The first clash took a piece of her shoulder. The second made her think briefly of falling asleep under the roots of a willow and letting the ice argue on without her. The third brought Jenna's lever to her side, a long arm of wood and iron that made a weight drop where it would do most good. She had named the lever Tywell's Stubbornness, and it performed with a predictability that made men love it. The fourth clash tipped two others into a crack, and Sala heard that sigh again and did not let it make her think of her mother. She had no time to be anyone's child. Ronald's men rang and rang. Edric held. Jaren found the seam with his archer's eye and knew where to speak his warmth. Riala pointed with a hand that shook not because of fear but because bodies are imperfect machines and hers had worked a long time, and that is cause for joy. Goran Hor, who had stumbled in a winter that he could have made into something else if he had known how to love anything but his own face, did a brave thing badly and was saved from dying of it by a boy with a bell cord around his wrist. The boy pulled the bell and it sang and men moved and the gap closed and Goran fell to his knees and laughed once. A dry cackle that might, in another life, have been the beginning of a better man. And Sala, because this has always been her story, though it has been a dozen other people's too, saw a thing she did not like and decided to break it. An other with iron laced into its chest moved with more confidence than its cousins. It tilted its head toward the aisle with a familiarity that offended her. She did not run at it. She made it careful. She pressed it with the slow insistence she saved for eels and for stubborn cousins and for the moments when her children thought they could climb out onto the rotten log and return with a treasure and a story. She made it consider her and then consider the edge and then consider, without meaning to, the crack. She put it there in its consideration, and the weight of its consideration broke the ice beneath it and took it down. It did not sigh. It went with a little snap like something that had bitten through the wrong nut. The light held and then thinned. The dead did what they had been doing since men first sang to them. They argued and came apart. The ice answered with its big bell. The living did what they do when their bodies are reminded what they are for. They held and breathed and cut and took hands and kept them from shaking. When it was finished, it was not finished. It will never be finished. But that day, the bell house did not ring because someone was afraid. It rang because a boy had been told to ring it at sunset to tell the sky that men were still keeping up their end of the agreement. Afterward, when the fire's color had done its trick of reminding people their faces could flush, Jenna walked out of the tent and leaned on the post and let her head hang for a moment, because looking up is a task when you have been making other people stand straight all day. Sala came to stand beside her. They put their hands side by side on the post. "He would have liked the lever," Jenna said. "He would have liked that you named it badly," Sala said. "He always liked to argue with what people called his things." Jenna laughed, came out tired and honest. "He called the road mine this morning in a letter," she said. "He never called anything mine when he was alive." "He is," Sala said, and saved her a sting by not saying more. Ronald wrote his letter to the watch without ceremony. He did not use any of the phrases men have learned to write when they are writing history. He wrote, "We held. The bell helps. Glass helps. We are as we were. Tell your men that." He sealed it with wax and sent it with 2 birds. Edric sat on a stool in a wayhouse and put his face into his hands for 1 minute. In that minute, a boy came and touched his elbow and said that his father had fallen into a hole, and Edric stood and went and pulled the man out himself. When he came back to the stool, the minute was gone and he did not need it anymore. Riala went to the lake one last time and looked. The faces did not move. They were in good company. Faces do their work without moving. She put her hand to the water's skin and it did not bite. It was only water again. She went home by the road and rode beside Sala for a while, letting the marsh choose how close it wanted to be. Beyond them, in a castle made mostly of noises and old pride, Gorenhor sat with his head in his hands and tried to think of a way to make this winter his story. He would fail. The Riverlands would learn to tell it without him, which is what happens to men who do not share their chairs. In Dragonstone, Balon Targaryen put on a cloak and walked out into a rain that did not like him and laughed into it, as if he had finally understood the joke the sea had been telling him in his sleep for 30 years. In Dorne, Nymer Martell said to his sister, "I am sending north again. I have learned to like being thanked." Sala Reed, tired and alight from within, sat on the edge of a hummock and let a frog climb into her palm. It blinked at her as if to remind her that it had its own theology. She placed it back in the water and watched the ripple make a small map and thought, as she always did, that if she had been born under a different sky she might have learned to make roads. And if Jenna had been born among rushes she would have learned to swim under a log without putting her head up once. She was glad they had not been born in one another's beds, because the world would have lost something properly arranged if it had not been able to surprise them with the ways their hands fit. The marsh fires burned low. Wind worried the blue tongues and they snapped and curled to embers. The sky had its thin, paired look. The wolf called and was answered. The bell hung on its cord and did not ring, and that silence had no meaning but the simplest. For one breath, in one place, the wrongness had spent itself, and the rightness was allowed to sit like a woman in her own chair at last. She let it sit. Then she rose, and her spear's glass caught a piece of light smaller than a fingernail, and she put her hand to the ooze to feel the deep heat, and she breathed, and she went to see where the road needed mending, which is what a person does when she is in love with a world that keeps offering to end.